Hey fearsome friends. Tonight I have some quite tearful stories. The first one I would like to announce is not aimed to be scary, but a memory of a beautiful encounter between a man and his late wife. But otherwise, there are a plethora of very spooky, hair-raising encounters. So sit back, relax, get cozy, comfy, warm, and remember, keep being creepy. It would be an understatement to say that I'm a skeptic. I've always been one to listen without judgment, but dismiss things as soon as I've been told as interesting, but not really anything more than that. All that changed just before Christmas. So here's a little backstory for you. My wife and I were married after a 5-year courtship on January the 1st, 2010. There were good times and there were some bad ones too. I won't go into many details, but during the course of our relationship, she suffered a major back injury, and while she was recovering from this, she became addicted to opioids, hydromorphine to be exact. She got addicted hard, and it took over her life for several years. I tried to be understanding, and I tried to help her myself, but when it became too much for me to handle on my own, or deal with at all anymore, I demanded that she either seek professional help for her problem or our marriage was done. She did the typical addict things, denied it and got mad, but finally she accepted that she had a problem. She checked herself into a detox facility for a month, and she struggled, but she ultimately succeeded and left that facility to then go straight into a full-blown rehab. 28 days later, she was home, clean and sober for the first time in years, and we re-established our relationship and fell in love all over again. Things were great for the next several months. We got to know each other again, and it was great. Until it wasn't. On May 2nd, 2018, she relapsed and sadly passed away. Reading her personal journals after she'd gone, I learned the following. She had been having some back pains again and had been fighting the urge to start using the drugs for it. She had been fighting silently for a couple of weeks when she broke down and relapsed, and the drug she relapsed with was fentanyl. She died within moments of her relapse, and that was the only thing that was found in her system at the time of her passing. I was devastated, and I spent the following months running an autopilot. Now, one thing I failed to mention earlier was that my wife was an incredible cook and baker. I've been keeping in close contact with her family ever since her passing, and one of the common themes during the holidays was how much they missed her baking and knowing that they would never get her treats during the holidays again. So this year I decided to try my hand at it, but I'm not adept in the kitchen at all, not even close. But I had her recipes and figured why the hell not. So off to the store I went. I loaded up on all the ingredients as per her recipes and fired up the stove. I spent 2 days making treats and dropping them off with her parents, brother and 2 sisters, and everyone was happy with them. There were some good conversations had and a couple of tears shed, and after everything I went home and started cleaning up the mess. Now, as I was standing in front of the sink doing the last of the dishes, I suddenly felt a hand, not an object, a hand, a palm and 5 separate distinct fingers on my lower back. It startled me so much that I screamed and jumped back, looking around, but there was nobody there. Then all of a sudden, I was overtaken with a sense of calm. I just felt right. I've never had something like that happen to me before. Then a few days later, I was lying in bed, just dozing off, and almost asleep, I felt something crawl into bed with me. I felt it right beside me. So I swung my hand back, thinking it was our cat, but there was nothing there. Nothing at all. I lay there awake for a while, hoping for something more, and still feeling that same calming warmth I'd had days earlier in the kitchen. Before I fell asleep that night, I whispered, "Thank you. I miss you. I love you." And since then I haven't had any more experiences, and I am no longer a skeptic. My name is Eden, and recently I turned 25. This is the first time that I'm going to share something personal of this nature, and it's something that really puzzles me, because I don't know if it's psychological or paranormal. Before I start though, I want to make my position clear on this whole issue. I consider myself a person totally open to any possibility, although I don't believe in God. But neither am I one to deny its existence, since my knowledge of the universe, its possibilities and its limitations or infinities is really null, like that of any human being. I was raised a Christian, and for a time I considered myself an atheist, but I'm now agnostic due to various events through the years, such as having premonitory dreams without knowing it, reading the feelings of people without exchanging a word, or even noticing strange things in the environment, whether positive or negative. I would even say that I've experienced astral travel, but the latter is not confirmed, as it was an occasion where it could have simply been a dream. Then finally, my instinct has always told me, although I deny it, that there are definitely things out there that none of us know anything about. So a couple of months ago, maybe a bit more, I had a dream. I was having a normal day, waking up, going to work, and speaking with people, etc. And as time went by, whenever I came across a familiar person in the dream, they were always accompanied by another person, which I understood to be a friend of theirs. The conversations with these acquaintances was going well, but the third person would never speak. They'd just smile or nod, which was normal enough. Then the conversation would end and we'd say goodbye. That is until, though, in the last exchange of glances, the companion would look at me with a smile that instantly deformed his face in an unpleasant and perverse way. At first, within the dream, I just thought it was my imagination, so I didn't care too much, and I was actually very impressed, since I hadn't seen a human face do that before. However, the same situation was repeated, where people unknown to me who accompanied my relatives made the same perverse face when saying goodbye. But then I found out that those relatives who had been talking to me disappeared. So I instantly linked everything and warned my family and relatives, but they of course ignored me, then too disappeared, and my sister and my mother remained. My sister then went to her house for a moment and disappeared too, so I stayed with my mother, and that thing entered through the window without any effort. He took the form of an Asian man between his 30s and 40s and was standing dead still in front of us, looking at us both. His face showed the same seriousness as when you would take something from a child, but at the same time his face described that he was inside, having fun and relaxed. The moment I realized my mother was going to be next, his face began to smile while it was deforming to grotesque proportions at the same time. My first instinct was to try to help my mother escape. I did this by trying to kill him as if he was human, strangling him with my own hands. But his face with that smile began to swell, and while he made fun of me, I remember that the swelling of his face reached to such a point that his head was getting closer to mine, although his body was firmly on the ground. Finally, I remember that in the moment I felt I was going to die, I suddenly woke up and realized that of course it was a nightmare. I was terrified by it, but ultimately I didn't take it seriously, because it was a dream, right? During that day I started to link the nightmare to when I was a child, where a thing that changed its shape, form or being and trying to be the most creepy it could be, would say the most horrible things that a kid should never hear. But still, I just put it down to being a coincidence and didn't think any more about it. Today, though, the same kind of dream happened. It seemed like I'd met the most handsome boy ever, with gorgeous skin and beautiful blonde hair, and because of that alone I knew it was a dream. But it very quickly turned nasty. We were in a hostile zone of the city because he lived there and had to get something from his house. So I followed him, taken over by his looks, when the boy started to caress my face. He then whispered in my ear, "We meet again, and you can see that I have captivated you with this form," then gave me a creepy smile. Suddenly I started to run as fast as I could, with him chasing close behind. He was running like a trained athlete, so I knew he was going to catch up to me soon. I screamed for people to help me, and thankfully they did, so I was able to escape. But I knew it wouldn't last long, and I don't know what happened to the people after that. Then I don't know how, but my body changed in some way, and I then came across a big house where I thought I could hide. It was perfect, because he would think that I'd arrived at my own house. When I got to the porch, the door opened slowly, and I ran in quickly and hid, but eventually he found me. I pushed him away as best I could and ran through the house trying to escape. I wriggled out of his grasp, but he was able to keep me from getting away. The last time I was within 3 rooms, 2 bedrooms and the toilet. I had the idea of placing my phone in the bath and pressing play on a song whilst I hid behind the door, as a kind of distraction, and it worked somehow. Although ultimately I was still trapped, as he was still in the area. Eventually he found me, and I hit him with the door. He laughed and I left that room, and when I started running down the stairs to get out of the house, he stopped, and his tongue stretched out of his mouth and came towards me, piercing the skin and muscles of my neck. Slowly it then made its way down my spine and left me paralyzed, lying face down on the floor. He then threw himself on me and said in my ear, "No matter how much you run, or if you change your appearance, it doesn't matter. I will always come for you. And no matter how hard you try to deny reality, I'm here, always, waiting for you to sleep." His mouth then opened like a monster, my death inevitable, but then I suddenly woke up, but with the same unpleasant sensation of his tongue running down my spine. This was the moment when I wasn't really sure if it was a simple nightmare or something more. I didn't discard it as being purely psychological, though. Have you any ideas? Has this happened to any of you? This occurred when I was 7 years old. I came from a very abusive childhood, both physically and emotionally, not sexually though, I might add, and I had never received a Christmas present, a birthday present, or any form of card or cake on special occasions. I didn't have my first proper birthday cake until I was in my 20s, when my friends found out and made up for my asshole parents. Anyway, going back to when I was a kid, it was one of those nights where I had been beaten, locked in my room and left to cry in the darkness. The pain from the punches to my face were burning as my tears rolled down my face, when suddenly there was a rattle at the door from where the lock was on the other side of it. Thinking it was one of my parents, I tried to hide behind the bed as best I could to shield myself from any further attacks, and peeking over the bed sheets, the door opened a slither, then closed. Thinking my parents had changed their minds on coming into the room and went back downstairs, I sat back on the bed, tears still falling and the pain still present, as it was then I noticed that there was no sound of my parents' footsteps moving away from my room. Then right at that moment, I felt a small hand, not that much smaller than mine, touch my cheek. It was icy cold, but the moment it touched my skin, the pain faded away, and I felt calm almost instantly, and the crying stopped. The touch then warmed slightly, then disappeared. I slept the whole night through, unfortunately without wetting the bed, only to find a small teddy bear beside my pillow. My parents saw me with it in the morning, grasping it close, and they immediately started fighting with each other, screaming, "Why did you get him that thing?" and "I didn't get him it, you must have, you bitch," and so on and so on. So clearly neither of them had had a slight change of heart. But whenever I needed comfort, that bear helped me remember that moment of the soothing touch and helped me get through some really bad times. Fast forward to when I left my parents' house years later. I had to pack bit by bit, keeping a few bags of clothes and boxes stored in the attic out of their way, as I left with very little, and it was one of my close friends that was helping me leave as soon as the coast was clear. It came time to leave, with my teddy bear in my hand, and grabbing my bag in the back of the attic, I noticed a pile of stuff that had been left by the previous owner of the house, which my parents hadn't thrown out. Looking through the stuff, I found a photo frame covered in cloth, so I pulled away the fabric and found it was a family portrait. In the photo was a small young girl, that couldn't have been more than 5 years old, with her parents, and in her small hands was the teddy bear that had appeared beside me all those years ago, that I still have to this day. I took the portrait, my teddy and my bag and left without looking back. After that, I just had to find out who lived at that house before my parents. So after contacting a few people to help track them down, I eventually made contact with them and met them at their new home. As it had turned out, their small daughter had passed away at the age of 5 from cancer, and the portrait was made not long before she died. I showed them the teddy bear, and they wondered how I'd gotten it. I told them my experience, and their eyes filled with tears of joy. They told me that before their daughter passed away, she spoke that she wanted her bear to help someone that needed him as she did. The little girl's name was Anna. The portrait was returned to her parents, but they told me that I was to keep the bear, as their daughter wanted me to have it. I will never forget that touch from that night, the feeling of calm that washed over me, and the relief from the pain and the power that that teddy bear has gotten me through. The Pacific Northwest may not be famous as a hotspot for the paranormal. However, I can tell you that the Northwest is far more haunted than many people realize. I am happy to share my own experiences, and those I am aware of from others. I don't have a ton of personal experience with shadow people specifically. I would appreciate hearing from anyone who has their own stories to tell. But despite the fact that I have had several paranormal experiences, most of them have not involved the dreaded shadows. The main experience I wanted to describe today, though, is pretty short. I hope it helps to catalogue something for people, though. I don't know the story of the entity I saw, nor do I know if there is a history of people seeing it besides me in that location. In fact, my dad and I used to like to go to a park called Shumway Park when I was a kid. We would go there and play around because it was pretty close to where we lived. The park is very close to a school called the Vancouver School of Arts and Academics, which isn't really relevant to my story, but you may want to check out any information you can find, see if anyone has reported shadow people at that location. I'd be interested to know in general about hauntings at that location, as I have yet not taken the time to look into it very well, but I'm certainly interested to know if there's anything that other people have seen there. Anyway, the point is that when I was a kid, I would regularly walk to that park with my dad and play there. My favourite thing to do there was a tyre swing. I would have my dad spin and push the swing like crazy until we were getting it really going fast. Well, one day, early afternoon in the summertime, I was swinging on that tyre swing, and we had really gotten it going. Then, as I was going, I could clearly see a figure standing by the tyre swing. I didn't really think anything of it, but I did feel a sense of unpleasantness around the figure. After a moment, I realized that the figure was now much closer. In fact, he was bearing down on me. This may be a bit hard to explain, but this thing was essentially standing, so that when I swung in its direction, I was looking up into what would have been its face, which seemed to be looking down into mine. This now seemed rather threatening, so I asked my dad to stop the swing, and he did. I looked around, but there was no one in the park at all. There was a woman jogging on the adjacent track, but otherwise it was all clear. I asked my dad if he had seen the man, but my dad didn't know what I was talking about, so naturally I freaked out. We immediately went home and did something back at the house instead. I don't think we ever went back to that park again, and we started going to other places instead. As an adult, I've jogged by that particular park and used it as a place to exercise a few times, but I've never seen anything amiss since then. I've not had another apparition of the Shadow Man, although, however, I have certainly felt watched whilst there. This area is home to a lot more ghosts and hauntings than most people are aware of. So this experience of mine happened my senior year in high school, and during this time I'd started dabbling with spirituality, or what is commonly referred to as New Age religion. I didn't know much besides the basics, and I was inexperienced. I remember one day I'd decided to wear my favourite pendulum necklace that my sister had given me as a birthday gift. So one day I was sitting in class, and my teacher was giving a lecture, when she suddenly stopped and stared at my necklace. She became intrigued and asked me if I knew how to use it, and obviously I responded by saying no. So realizing she did, I began asking her questions about how to use a pendulum and whatnot. We began to converse, and this was the beginning of our friendship. It became stronger, and soon every day I was hanging out with her during lunchtime. During this time, we would talk about spirituality and practice our meditation together. It became our daily routine, and soon enough I was practicing the advanced arts. I excelled quickly, but during this time, weird and creepy stuff started to happen. For example, my pendulum would unexplainably knot in itself in front of our eyes. A flock of birds would leave poop only on her car, and other instances of unexplained phenomenon. Time went by quickly, and I was now a couple of days from graduation. But this particular day, though, was one of the most scariest moments in my life. It started during third period class, while my teacher was giving a lecture. In the middle of the room there was an empty space, except for the projector cart and my teacher, when I began to see what looked like a white ball of light on the floor. I would describe it as if someone had taken a big magnifying glass and pointed it at the carpet floor. I thought it was a light trick and looked around the room to see if anything was making a reflection, but I couldn't find a thing. I then asked my friends if they could see what I was seeing, but they all said no. They even asked me if I was on drugs, or if I'd not gotten enough sleep or something. At this point I started to freak out, because what I was seeing was not going away. I even tried blinking, but the ball of light was still there, and it was now beginning to expand. I blinked 3 times, closed my eyes and looked away, and when I opened them again, it was gone. Class ended and I headed to my 4th period class, and this is where it hit the fan. Class began and ended as usual, and I stayed after class like I always did to talk and meditate. About 7 minutes into meditation though, I began to hear what sounded like whispers. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't creepy and that it was part of a higher realm, but I instead tuned into it, and soon enough, the voices started to get louder and multiply. At this point, I immediately stopped what I was doing and started to tell my teacher what was happening. She stopped her meditation and began to talk to me, but our conversation was cut short, as I felt what I can only compare to as the feeling of dread, almost like someone was out to kill me. I screamed and ran around the desk and behind my teacher, holding onto her shoulders for comfort. I started to think, who the hell is crying like that? They sound like a bitch. But then I realized that I was the one who was crying. It took my brain a little while to process what was happening, and after all, I couldn't see whatever this thing was and couldn't explain why I felt this way. My teacher immediately started to fire energy balls at the thing, yelling and telling it to go back to where it came from, as it didn't belong here. It freaked me out even more when she did this, and I started crying even louder. This commotion continued for a couple of minutes more, until she stopped throwing attacks at it. I, obviously shaken up, tried to calm down enough to speak. After a couple of minutes, I began to collect myself, and then started to ask her questions about what had just happened. She told me that when I'd run behind the desk and behind her, she saw what appeared to be a green demon turning an invisible corner. When she said invisible corner, I automatically thought of a pocket dimension, and it reminded me of the white ball of light on the floor that I'd seen earlier. I then realized why the white ball was trying to grow. It could have only been something trying to get into this dimension through me. My ignorance of opening up doorways that shouldn't have been opened caused this to happen, and after that experience, I vowed to never involve myself with New Age religion or what is commonly referred to as spirituality again. Have you ever gotten a strange phone call right when you mentioned a loved one who had passed away? If you have, you know how strange it can be. This incident in particular happened late one night in my grandma-in-law's kitchen. Grandma had a sister-in-law who was visiting from the East Coast. She had gotten in late that night, and I went over to visit the two of them with my husband. We were all sitting around the kitchen table, the same one my grandpa-in-law's mother had owned when she built the house, and there were a lot of jokes going around the table. Grandma started coughing from laughing too hard. She was in poor health as it was, and she was supposed to take breathing treatments. However, with her having so much fun, which is a rare occasion since Grandpa had passed, she didn't want to leave the table. My husband was concerned and told her she had to take her breathing treatment. After some convincing, she got up and started heading in that direction, but then she got sucked back into the conversation and distracted from her treatment again. She again started coughing heavily, and this was the moment when my husband told her again she needed to take her treatment. "If Grandpa saw you right now, he'd be nagging you to take your treatment," my husband told her. "That's right," Grandma's sister-in-law said. "Don't make me have him call you." Grandma gave a little, "Yeah, right," kind of chuckle. Then right at that moment, the sister-in-law's track phone that she only uses when travelling started to ring. We all stood there spooked for a moment, and the sister-in-law went to answer it. But when she did, it immediately disconnected, after it had rung several times. The weirdest part was that this was at around 11:30 East Coast time, on a phone that no one would have had the number for outside of immediate family. Grandma immediately took her breathing treatment after that, not wanting to argue with what could have been a message from beyond the grave. Her husband had always reminded her about her treatments while alive, so it wouldn't be unusual for him to do the same after. I'm not sure exactly what happened there, but I like to think it was Grandpa. I know that my grandma felt that way too, especially after other instances of footsteps in the house and sounds of him getting up in the night for water long after he had passed. From a very young age, I realized that I had this strange ability, the sixth sense, which literally allows me to experience what I believe to be the spirit world or another dimension, so to speak. It is existing in our reality and hidden in plain sight, but invisible to other people. There are supernatural entities moving among us humans. It is similar to the Sixth Sense movie, where Cole Sear saw dead people. But what I see are not people's souls, and they do not appear and disappear from time to time, as they are always present. I did not ask for this ability though, and it is not pleasant to endure. I consider it much more of a curse than a blessing. So through a kind of very fine static, I can see and feel how supernatural entities manifest themselves. The vast majority of them are humanoid in form, in all sizes. It's difficult to explain, but through this static, especially if I stare at them directly at night, the humanoid bodies of these entities become more real, as if they were translucent figures with a slight white tinge. I see their shoulders, heads, necks, and even some traits of what would be their faces, like noses and eyes, that are of a pale white colour, and they know that I can see them. Every day, every second, wherever I go, they are there, almost invisible and silent witnesses of our lives, of my life. In addition to seeing these figures, I have experienced hundreds of paranormal situations related to what I see, which in my opinion are demons, angels, the presence of God and Jesus, and spirits of living people who left their bodies to roam. It's too maddening, scary, intimidating and exhausting to pretend that everything is fine when it's not, and I can't do anything to prevent it. I have also countless times seen what seem to be golden lights that are very similar to those that Mrs. Dorothy Isaac managed to capture in physical evidence. Most of the time they appear and disappear very quickly, in fractions of a second, but supernaturally their appearances last longer than what my natural eyes can see. In the case of angels, in the daytime they appear in white and gold lights, and sometimes in humanoid forms very quickly. And at night, even with my eyes closed, these golden lights appear and illuminate me quickly, waking me up when I am already asleep. Their sudden appearances make me feel a strange heat and numbness in the part of my body where the lights had touched or appeared on me. A few times in the midst of those lights, I have seen some strange visions too. Now regarding the demons, the vast majority of the time, I see them as dark amorphous forms. So dark in fact that no artificial light or even the sun can be reflected in their darkness. It's a strong blacker than black colour that we know, although on a few occasions I have also seen them take different forms. For example, once I saw a snake with a goat's skull curling up on a wall. The first time I saw a demon in another form that was not amorphous was when I was about 10 years old and I was in my room. In the middle of the night I woke up and saw this demonic creature right next to me. He had a body like a human, muscular, tall, and whose body was black, blacker than night. It was lit up and outlined from behind by the streetlights that shone through the window, that were strangely enough open. It had orange, translucent, bat-like wings, and from what would be its fingers were kind of long claws instead. I have also seen demons appear before me in the form of what others would call ghosts, in the form of people. But I know they were demons. I have also seen demon eyes appear in random people on the street, as if manifested through the humans, and even their human faces transform into demons for a few seconds. Sometimes in my brain I feel this kind of chemical reaction to the supernatural, feeling it like a hot electrifying sensation in the back left side of my head. When going outside of my house, I don't know if the same entities are following me, or if there are others, but they are always present. I would even dare to say that there are billions more of these entities flooding our world, and in the case of demons, fooling people into believing that their dead loved ones can return to this world as ghosts is not true. Once you die, you no longer return to this world, and your soul goes either to heaven or hell. There are no more options. I have already told my parents before about my ability, but they didn't take me seriously, until when I was about 11 years old. I very sincerely explained to my parents what I had seen and had a good talk with them. They took me to specialists who after many tests ruled out that I had schizophrenia, so they then just believed that I was making it all up, and that I only said it because I was an attention seeker. They took me to psychologists to talk about my problem, with hope that I would improve. So this happened around 3 years ago, and I haven't written it out before. I've only told close friends and family. My friend's grandpa has a huge ranch that is, I think, 300 to 500 acres, give or take, and it sits near the entrance of the ranch, while a small bunkhouse is situated pretty far off from the main house, nestled against the tree line that leads into the more unmanaged areas of the land. The bunkhouse was really cool. It was where we would stay when visiting, and it had 2 inflatable mattresses, reclining chairs, a shuffleboard and TV. We hadn't planned on spending much time there though, as we wanted to get drunk, go fishing and shoot the guns that I had brought with us. This time I'd brought a friend with me, who was 18 at the time and I was 19, and we were just looking forward to spending a few days chilling on our own and feeling grown up. On the first day after we were done shooting some bull skulls in the boneyard with the Mosin and the 22, we both finished a tall boy and were a little buzzed but not really drunk in any way. So we decided to hop in the Ranger and head back to the bunkhouse, which was about a 4-minute drive away. On our way back, the sun was starting to set, and because we were in Texas, the sunset was an absolute gorgeous gradient of deep reds and bright oranges. We looked off to the edge of the property, because that's where the sunset was, and as we were staring off into the distance, we both noticed what we thought was some hogs running through the brush and into the tree line. We slowed down a little so we could get a better look, because they would be the first hogs we'd seen on our trip. We didn't have the assault rifle with us though, unfortunately, so we didn't bother making a full stop to take pot shots at them. You see, our normal instinct would be to stop the Ranger and take them down, as they're a pest in this area of the world. Sorry, animal lovers, it has to be done. We looked on and noticed that it actually wasn't a small group of pigs running at all, but what looked like a couple of hunched over figures. I don't want to say they looked humanoid, because we really didn't get a good enough look at their shape. But I don't know. The way they were loping through the underbrush was weird and vaguely human. We were both confused, trying to figure out what the hell we were looking at, but they'd managed to get far enough away to be out of sight before either of us could really even guess what they were. It's really hard to explain as we saw so little of the things, so it really shouldn't have unnerved us as much as it did, especially seeing as we were buzzed with guns in tow and probably felt badass. We hurried to the bunkhouse, quietly mentioning how whatever it was weird, and since we were done shooting for the day, we decided to get well and truly drunk and left the Ranger at the bunkhouse, hiking a small way up to the creek. We brought out some folding chairs and climbed a small cliff to set them up and smoke some weed. As my friend was packing a bowl, off in the distance, a pretty significant amount of movement caught our attention. We looked down towards the vague hints of motion and once again saw the hunched dark figures looming in the underbrush of the forest. This time, though, it was easy to tell there were 3 of them, and they moved around carefully, getting closer to us, then randomly backing off. They seemed to keep a consistent distance, but randomly got closer and further away if we looked away for a minute. We got so invested in watching these little things and wondering what they were that we forgot to spark up the bowl. Eventually we ignored the shapes, smoke up and finish our drinking on the shore of the creek, and nothing eventful happened besides us hearing rustling every now and again, which was more than likely a rabbit or something similar. We got drunk, wandered back to the cabin and passed out. And now this is where the genuinely weird stuff happens. That night I had this incredibly vivid dream of hiking to the boneyard where we were shooting, with my friend standing next to me. We both were in tattered furs for clothes, and I distinctly remember the feeling of damp, untreated hide against my skin. We made our way to the center of the small boneyard and assembled a weird statue out of the bones. I guess effigy might have been a better word than statue, but whatever you want to call it, we made this weird ritualistic-looking form out of the bones, and as soon as we'd finished, the loping, hunched shapes came out of the darkness and began tearing and cutting us apart. The feeling of cold sharpness cutting into me was extremely vivid and almost genuinely painful. I woke up in a cold sweat, and I saw my friend just kind of sitting up in his bed, staring at the bunkhouse door. He got up, I think not noticing that I was already awake, and peered out through the blinds. He then muttered something to himself and came over to shake me awake. As he moved over to me, he saw that I was wide awake already and told me to, "Come look at this." Looking out into the forest, the bunkhouse was nudged against, and the figures were there. Crawling and moving, all hunched over, but still too dark and vague for me to tell what they could be. He stopped looking through the blinds and turned on a lamp, and we started playing war with some poker cards and talked about the weird shapes. We spoke about when we'd first saw them, and then seeing them again at the creek. He told me that he'd had a really bad feeling when we were drunkenly walking back to the bunkhouse, then started telling me about a messed up dream he'd just had. And well, I'm sure you've already guessed it. The dream was exactly what I had dreamed, right to a T, and I mean every single detail, to the weird furs that we wore, to the shapes coming at us and clawing us. For the rest of the trip we kept seeing the shapes in the distance, but they seemed to move less and be less full of energy after our last encounter. What is interesting to note, though, is that after my friend told his grandfather about what happened, he no longer allows anyone to stay in the bunkhouse, and from what I heard, has converted it into a glorified storage shed. Now, my great-grandmother died when I was 12. She was a very strong-willed woman and would come to my defense when my grandma abused me or when anyone would try to hurt me. Sadly, though, she developed breast cancer, which metastasized quickly and became terminal when she was 80 years old. Now, the day before she passed away, she started talking to a man that we couldn't see. We were all in the living room, but her bedroom door was open and was directly connected to the living room, so we could hear her. We asked her who she was talking to, and she said, "That man right there," pointing to the empty chair on the other side of her bed. We told her that there was no one there, to which she replied, "Of course there is. It's death coming to get me." Grandma then took me by my shoulder and pushed me out of the room, closing the door behind us. The only bathroom in this apartment was through the bedroom, and after a few hours, I had to go. So with Grandma's okay, I went in and did my business. As I went in, she was laying on her side, facing away from me, so I assumed she was asleep. But when I walked out of the bathroom, she was looking at me in absolute terror. She started screaming my grandma's name at the top of her lungs, so my grandma rushed in and pushed me out to the living room, not bothering to shut the door as she tried to calm her mother down. I still remember exactly what great-grandma said. "Keep that boy away from me. He isn't what he seems and he's cursed." Grandma shut the door after that. She had a sister bring me back home that night, who just said that great-grandma must have thought I was her dead husband, because her mind was going, but I felt like that explanation was a little off. Now fast forward 17 years to the second story and kind of the focal point of this post. I had been the sole live-in home care provider for my grandfather, who had been living in the country for a year straight. Being on shift 24/7, he'd set up an alarm system in my room to wake me at the press of a button, so I'd not had much sleep and not a single day off for over a year. It was supposed to have been temporary and I was supposed to be replaced with 2 care providers in a few months, but it never happened. So eventually I quit, as it was negatively impacting my health, and we didn't get along at all. I moved back to my hometown and rented a room from a friend, and after getting settled in and missing my mother dearly, who I had lost a few years before, I had the strangest dream. It went like this. I was at the base of a hill with just green grass ahead of me and fog on the top of the hill all around. It was dead silent. My grandmother was at the top of the hill, waving desperately at me and saying something, but no sound was coming from her mouth. I ran up the hill to try to hear what she was saying, but couldn't hear her until I was right in front of her. She was screaming at me, "You're not supposed to be here. If they find you, you won't just die. You'll cease to exist altogether. Run." Then I heard voices beyond the fog that sounded like they were looking for me. I ran down the hill as fast as I could and through the fog on the bottom, and that's when I woke up, with her voice ringing in my ears. "I love you, but you can never come back here," she said. I couldn't believe what I had just dreamed, especially because on a normal day, I could barely remember her face without looking at a photo, but I recognized her instantly in the dream, voice, face and all. The room I was renting was in a shack in the backyard. It was meant to be a bar, but had been properly insulated to be used as a guest room. I walked outside and into the house to get something to eat, and was greeted by my friend. He informed me that I'd been asleep for 2 days straight, and this was the night of the 3rd. I just want to preface this post by stating that this is 100% a genuine encounter and not fictitious at all. It occurred a few years back, and I get scared, uneasy and upset simply recalling it, but I have never read or found anything like it anywhere else. The recent vampire lady from the new Resident Evil game, which has gone viral, actually triggered my memory of this encounter, and my story draws some parallels. I again must assure you that this was a genuine experience, and I am looking to shed light on something that has profoundly disturbed me. To set the scene, imagine any normal main street in any normal town on an early Sunday morning, early enough that only a handful of cafes and shops have only just opened. It's deep into winter, and there's some patches of ice dotted about the pavement, and it's cold enough that steam forms when you exhale. I just bought a coffee to go to warm myself up while I was looking into the shop windows. There were a few people milling about, but the street was largely empty and quiet. It's also pedestrianised, so there are no cars or traffic. As I was approaching the local bookstore, coming towards me in the opposite direction was a woman. She looked to be in her 60s or 70s, was wearing a long, flowing winter coat in a 50s style with fur trims on the neck, arms and the bottoms around her ankles. She had a bowler-type hat on with a feather attached to it and was carrying a handkerchief which was held up over her mouth. Now at first this wouldn't seem anything out of the ordinary, but as we walked closer and past one another, it was abundantly clear that there was something incredibly off about this person. Firstly, she was deathly pale. It was the first thing I'd noticed, and I don't simply mean a pale complexion, but ghostly, deathly white. It could have been achieved by makeup, but it was extremely jarring to observe and very obvious. Secondly, as we passed one another, it was then clear that this woman was incredibly tall, almost gigantic. You could write off or explain someone who was maybe 6.5 foot tall, but I'm nearly 6 foot and was completely dwarfed by this woman. I would have guessed she could have been anywhere up to 10 to 12 feet. We intersected outside the bookstore, and she easily stood above both the shopping window and entrance door, just using things nearby as a gauge for height. As she passed and my brain began to process what I'd just seen, my blood ran ice cold, and I just stopped in my tracks. I briefly swung around to see her enter a side street, and that was that. I know some of you may dismiss this encounter as a joke, or simply say I misjudged someone's height, but I can recall this happening as clear as day, and I have no logical explanation for what I saw. This lady simply was something else, and I have no other words, as there are none to really portray coming face to face with something you can't explain, something that is so completely outside the realms of reality, you can't mentally process what you're witnessing. Hey there, it's me again, Miss Fearsome. I hope you enjoyed my video. If you did, then please hit that subscribe button. And if you'd like to support me further, please check out my Patreon and sign up for as little as $1 a month. Also, check out my new YouTube membership levels with some exclusive perks. So until next time, stay happy, stay safe, and remember, keep being creepy.